They're promising to reduce bills by an average of £50 a year, but the government has denied they've told the big energy firms to hold their prices until the next election. Downing Street insisted they've just asked the companies not to pass on the cost of abolishing the green levy onto consumers. But Labour, which has called for a freeze, branded the government's policy as shambles. Our business correspondent Sarah Smith reports.
Yes, it is still November, but Christmas is already here. And the government's planning an early Christmas gift for voters, cutting our energy bills by about £50 each. They firmly deny that they're demanding a price freeze, but they are trying to find ways to make it cheaper to turn the festive lights on. A 50 quid giveaway to every household in Britain could certainly make Christmas a bit merrier. And the Chancellor could save us all that much on our energy bills if he removes some of the government levies. But there's no point in him doing that if the energy companies are then just going to turn around and put their prices up by exactly the same amount. So industry sources have told me that there have been complex and detailed discussions between the government and the big six energy firms, with the government asking them to keep their prices down if the government do remove some of those levies. So what are the government levies on your energy bill? Well, out of the average yearly bill, £34 goes on subsidies for renewable energy. £14 is spent on the carbon tax. If the government removed the Warm Homes discount, then that would save customers £11 a year. And if the £69 currently spent on the energy company's obligation to insulate homes is spread over 4 years rather than 2, that will halve the cost to consumers.
Well, I've said all along that I want to help households and families by getting sustainably low energy prices. Now, the only way you can do that is by increasing competition and rolling back the costs of some of the levies on people's bills. I said that's what we were going to do. That is what we're going to do, and I think that's a very positive step forward.
So we're talking about energy prices, big issue for lots of people.
The Labour leader was in Manchester today, talking energy prices with people who struggle to pay their bills. People who like his plan to make energy companies freeze their prices for 20 months.
And it's a real worry, because a lot of my money goes on heating.
The government dismissed Miliband's plan as a Marxist con, but now they're doing something very similar themselves. They might not be forcing the energy companies to keep their prices down, but they are asking them to.
What we now know is that while David Cameron has in public been opposing an energy price freeze, in private he's been pleading with the energy companies to get him off the hook.
Christmas shoppers and market traders all want someone to keep the prices down, but aren't convinced that the government can do it.
We use a lot of electricity on the stall and, in our lockups and everywhere, so we don't really want anything to go up because we'll be out of pocket.
I don't see what the government says is going to have anything to do with it. It's privatised, it's got nothing to do with the government.
You probably won't find too much holly or ivy decking the halls in Downing Street this year. No nice Christmas wreaths like this one. Not now, it's been reported David Cameron says he wants to get rid of all the green crap off our energy bills. And that's because the big six energy firms have done a great job at persuading people the reason that prices are going up is because of government levies. So this plan doesn't ask them to cut their profits at all. It simply reduces our bills by shrinking the amount that the companies have to spend on government initiatives. The Chancellor thought this plan would let him play Santa next week when he delivers his autumn statement. He must be furious that we've all now had a peek at the presents and ruined his surprise.
Well, as you heard from Sarah Smith there, although the details have yet to be clarified, it does look as if the government's preparing to intervene in the energy market. So after similar state interventions on cigarette packaging and payday lenders, are we seeing a new kind of Tory moral capitalism, bold enough to stand up to big business? Or have they been pushed into it by the left? Here's our culture and digital editor, Paul Mason.
In workmanlike fashion, Mr. Attlee got busy with trowel and mortar before the stone was lowered into place.
When Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee laid the first brick on London's South Bank, he was cementing a political consensus. State intervention good, the free market to be discouraged. The government set the price of energy, water, milk, steel. Today the consensus is supposed to be against intervention. The concrete of the South Bank prettied up. Marketised, literally. Suddenly, the government's in a mood to tweak capitalism, capping energy prices, putting cigarettes in brown paper bags, and now, reportedly, asking the energy companies to freeze their prices till the next election. It's got the Tory right hopping mad.
I think there's a bigger narrative, and the narrative is that the government's given up on market forces and have embraced effectively price controls on just about everything. Endless interventions in the market. They want to have an intervention to reduce energy prices, an intervention to cap payday loans, and so on and so forth. Wherever you look, they want to regulate. They no longer believe in market forces. And effectively, they've embraced a new corporatist consensus, which is also shared by the Labour Party.
It's not long ago the Conservatives were saying this.
Attempts to fix prices and confiscate wealth crush Endeavour.
What's up? You know these British gas shares? They're really easy to do. Give them a ring. You see, tell him.
This is how the government sold off the gas industry in the 80s. But even after privatisation, the energy market exists in a web of permits, levies, tax breaks, emissions targets and network price controls. Those who like state intervention say it must be for a purpose.
If the objective is actually to have an energy market that really is more competitive, that is more innovative, that is one where these big energy companies are in fact investing their profits in, for example, renewable energy of the future, then really what we need to do is actually to change the behavior of these companies. It's wrong to think that there's somehow just these autonomous agents and then you have this heavy hand of the meddling government that's going to come in and say cap prices or other types of regulations. What we need is ask the question, what kind of behavior do we actually want in this sector?
Today's bout of will they, won't they is part of a pattern. The government said they wouldn't cap the cost of payday loans, and then they did. They ditched the idea of plain cigarette packets and then revived it. And for critics on the right, it's all becoming a bit grey concretey again, a bit 1950s.
There's always been government intervention and regulation, but when you actually start trying to manipulate market prices, trying to fix markets, that's very different. And you used to have that, especially, for example, in the 1970s. But in the 80s and 90s and noughties, both parties moved away from that quite heavily. In fact, people moved away from that all over the world. But what's happening in Britain right now is this is being re-embraced. But it's not being embraced because of a broad theory or broad vision here. It's just being embraced because of tactical surrenders, effectively, from the Tories and the coalition in the, against a Labour onslaught.
Is freezing energy prices a good idea or a communist plot? I'll leave the communist plots to him.
The government has stumbled on a problem historians of the market know too well. Once you tinker with it, you need to have an aim in mind.
No market in the history of capitalism has ever been completely free. They've always been shaped and even been created in many cases by the state. And so the real question is, what is it that we actually want these markets to be doing, and then to think about different policies in order for those markets to perform the way that we want.
Ever since the financial crisis, politicians of all parties have been confused about the role of state intervention. Philosophically, their generation grew up against it. Practically, they've had to do it, and it looks like they'll do more. Because bills are rising and an election is coming.
Paul Mason reporting. Well, we did ask the government, including the Department for Energy and Climate Change, the Treasury and the Department for Business Innovation and Skills to come and talk to us about this, but no one was available. We then tried every Conservative MP on the Treasury and Energy Select Committees, as well as a few others for good measure, to see if they'd come on and defend their party's energy plans. But none of them were available either. So we're joined instead by Jonathan Reynolds, the Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change. Jonathan Reynolds, I'm sorry you've drawn the short straw of having to comment on the government's policy, but these government talks with the energy companies are just the kind of state intervention you should be able to support, aren't they?
No, and I don't think this is a Christmas present for the people of Britain. I think it's a Christmas present for the energy companies. The only sensible long-term policy to reduce bills is to make sure people need less energy, even if the unit price of that energy is going up, and to withdraw the energy efficiency programme, where people have been promised measures under that which now won't be delivered next year, is a very, very strange way to go indeed.
But
in fact,
the only
way
off
to
everybody's bills is a lot more doable than your policy of freezing the energy bills, isn't it? Because, I mean, the chances are that would be challenged in the courts. You want to bring it in immediately you get into power, the chances are you wouldn't be able to.
Absolutely not. It'll definitely happen, but it's also a freeze and a reform package to produce a much more transparent and a fairer energy market. But no, if you look at the cost of eco, if you look at the cost of eco in your,
if it gets challenged in the courts, how can you introduce it immediately then?
It won't get challenged in the courts. That is exactly what people said about things like the windfall tax in 1997. That was passed and it was a great success. But if you look from your package at the cost of the eco-energy efficiency programme, if you look at extending that by 2 years, by doubling in effect the length of time to deliver it, you're only going to save something like £1 a week from people's energy bills, but you're going to leave them hooked on the need for a lot more expensive energy. And by the way you get those measures delivered more cheaply is to build up a supply chain, a pipeline, so they're delivered at a scale where the cost comes down. Insulation companies have set themselves up to do that, and now they're going to have the rug pulled out from underneath them.
Okay,
and
but
it means that all of that work built up will now be undermined.
Okay, but at least the government's nascent policy appears to take into account wholesale gas prices, whereas your freeze is pretty meaningless when Ed Miliband's admitted that he'd have to think again if there was a sudden wholesale price soaring.
No, that's not the case. Energy companies buy their wholesale goods many years in advance. It wouldn't be the case that if there was a spike in prices during
hang on a
the
sec.
time of the energy freeze that they'd have to respond to that.
Ed Miliband said just a few months ago, of course, if there was a major shock, companies could make their case.
Well, they could make their case, but we're absolutely resolute that the price freeze and the reforms that Ed has announced today will go ahead. And that's the way to do it. If you want to bring prices down, if you want to bring people's bills down, you have to tackle overcharging, and that's what's happening at the minute.
So
the way to bring bills down is not to undermine the efficiency programme the government have already announced.
OK, but if the wholesale gas price suddenly doubles, what are companies to do?
They'll already have bought the gas that they'll be delivering during the time of the price freeze. So, you know, let's look at what the problems are in the energy market. It's a market where it isn't transparent, where people can't see clearly what price the energy is being traded at from the generation price to the retail side. And if you want to rebuild trust and you want fairer prices, you've got to go down the reform package that Ed announced today.
Jonathan Reynolds, thank you very much for joining us when the government didn't. Jackie.
Thousands of people have been demonstrating in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, after their president abruptly shelved plans to agree a landmark trade deal with the European Union. The agreement was all but ready to be signed at an EU summit today when President Yanukovych demanded more financial aid from the West. He insisted Ukraine was still committed to signing the agreement at some stage, but pro-Europeans are still demanding his resignation. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports.